Mitrovitz's description contains the typical elements of male conversion to Islam in the context of the Ottoman elite. After having declared his intention to embrace Islam, the convert was usually presented to an Ottoman official or the Sultan himself, who rewarded him with gifts, particularly Ottoman-style garments and a turban. Afterwards, though occasionally after a lapse of several days, the convert underwent circumcision. In the process, he also assumed a new name, usually qualified with the fictional patronymic Ibn Abdullah. And especially for foreigners, the decision to convert to Islam therefore meant not only becoming a Muslim, but also undergoing an often quite radical process of Ottomanization. In today's presentation, I want to explore Märt's conversion and his attempts to make sense of and justify what in the eyes of most of his Christian contemporaries was the ultimate act of treason to Christianity and Christendom. In my view, Märt's case supports Tiana Christ's analysis that the Ottoman Empire participated in the so-called Age of Confessionalization, which witnessed the hardening of intra as well as inter-religious boundaries. In contrast to the converts discussed by Tiana in a recent book on contested conversions, who, quote, readily entered the debate about the correct rituals and the most authentic scripture-based path towards salvation, end quote, Märt's engagement with the religious polarization which characterized this period was more ambivalent, revealing an aspect which, as Martin Moser has pointed out several years ago, actually about a decade ago, has largely been overlooked by historians interested in the confessionalization paradigm. So, who was Ladislaus Märt? Much of what we know about Ladislaus Märt's life prior to his conversion stems not from Mitrovitz's memoirs, but from a petition which the former steward appears to have presented to Sultan Murad III shortly after his conversion to Islam. This document has survived in a German translation, which is preserved among the diplomatic dispatches from Istanbul in the Viennese archives. The document closely resembles the so-called Kizil-Bahasa petitions studied by Anton Minkoff, by which new converts to Islam requested favors, usually in the form of garments or their monetary equivalent, from the Sultan. From this petition, we learn that Märt had pursued a military career prior to becoming Kirkwitz's steward. This is the quotation. He claims to have participated in the corsairing voyages of the Knights of St. John and participated, quote, in all major wars, end quote, of the King of Spain and other Christian rulers, notably, of course, the War of Cyprus of 1570 to 1571 and the ensuing Battle of Lepanto. In the last 8 years before leaving for the Ottoman capital, Märt had served on the Ottoman-Habsburg frontier in Croatia, specifically in Karlovac, which is Karlstadt in German, and Bihać down here, which is Vihać in German. Although he may have somewhat enhanced his rank in the petition, claiming that he had been a high-ranking officer, the records kept in the war archives in Vienna confirm the basics of this story. In February 1591, the protocols of the Inner Austrian War Council, which was responsible for the administration of the Croatian border, record the council's confirmation of Märt's dismissal as ensign, Fähnrich in German, at the fortress at Bihać, after he had been absent from his post without permission for more than a year. Other than this, we know very little about Märt's background. Like Mitrovitz, the embassy's apothecary Friedrich Seidel wrote down his memoirs after his return from captivity in Istanbul and adds that the former steward had, quote, studied in Rome for 6 years and was proficient in several languages, end quote. Yet even Märt's age at conversion remains unknown. Given his military experience, it is reasonable to assume, however, that he would have been at least in his late 30s or early 40s in 1593, assuming that sort of the Battle of Lepanto, the War of Cyprus would have been his first military action. Mitrovitz mentions that the former steward was married to a daughter of the Bohemian noble house of Pernstein, which suggests that he himself was of noble descent, even if none of the Rhines of his family name appear in the relevant genealogical guides. Noble birth is also suggested by his identification as being to Altenburg, which, in light of his wife's ancestry, points towards modern-day Stare Radi in Bohemia, up here, or possibly present-day Altenburg and present-day Thuringia as his family seat. But as you can see, the name is ambiguous, and there's a possibility that he might also have been, in theory at least, from Altenburg in Lower Austria. As far as his religious affiliation prior to his conversion to Islam is concerned, Märt appears in Seidel's words as a, quote, first-rate Catholic, end quote, a characterization which, at least on the surface, is supported by his studies in Rome, even if Seidel, as a Lutheran, may have meant his statement as an insult rather than as a praise. Be that as it may, Märt, unlike Murad bin Abdullah, about whom Tiana will tell us more this afternoon, was first and foremost a soldier rather than a scholar, who engaged with the intricacies of theological debate. This rather pragmatic take on religion is evident in his attempts to give meaning to his decision to convert to Islam. As historians working on the conversion of Christian Europeans to Islam have repeatedly pointed out, skip those. So as they have repeatedly pointed out, religious conversion opened up possibilities for social advancement. If Mitrovitz's memoirs are to be believed, Ladislas Mert was rewarded not only with the title of Bey, but also received an income of 40 akçe per day, that is just over 14,000 akçe per year. Mert's petition, however, values the grant even higher at 20,000 akçe annually, which, judging from Metin Kun's work on the Ottoman elite, was at the upper end of timars awarded to members of the provincial cavalry who otherwise held no offices in the provinces. So it would have been a rather substantial grant already. Crucially, the petition also reveals that, at least at this point in time, Koca Sinan Pasha had not awarded an actual grant, but merely the promise of a timar to be given to the new convert at some point in the future, quite possibly from lands yet to be conquered. Mert's financial situation immediately following his conversion, therefore, was probably rather precarious. And consequently, he pleads with the emperor, and I quote, "Most merciful emperor, I have nothing to support myself and have become the object of my enemies, the infidels' ridicule, as they know that I have left behind property as well as honors and titles at home, and now walk the face of the earth as a stranger who has nothing and finds himself in great poverty." End quote. Consequently, Mert appealed to the Sultan's mercy as well as his political and religious pride. Once more from his petition, "I therefore beg your great majesty to grant me out of your imperial charity some grace and help, so that I can appropriately equip myself with garments and horses and honorably serve your great and felicitous majesty as it is my birthright, and present myself before the countries and villages of my enemies, so that these infidels will see and recognize what I have done and to whom I have betaken myself, and realize that your great majesty accepts, welcomes, and promotes with mercy and clemency those who take refuge at your sublime and felicitous port, so that more people of honor and rank come hither and surrender themselves to your great majesty." In this passage, Mert very obviously plays on the inter-imperial rivalry between the House of Osman and the Austrian Habsburgs, which were fought not merely as a battle for territory and taxable subjects, but also as a battle for souls. The symbolic capital inherent in the religious conversion of the imperial ambassador's steward is driven home in Mitrovitz's description of the circumcision festivities, which included a procession along what is today's Divan Yolo Caddesi, and thus directly past the El Cihan, down here where the X marks the spot, where the imperial embassy was housed. And this is Divan Yolo Caddesi, and this is a modern map of Istanbul. Up here we have Topkapı Palace, here's the Hagia Sophia, so it was a very prominent spot. It is not surprising, well, the conversion of the embassy steward was a symbolic victory over the Habsburgs, which of course needed to be publicly communicated and celebrated in style, very obviously. It is not surprising, therefore, that Mert, in his petition to Murat III, explicitly links his new religious affiliation with a declaration of loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan, and as he explains, "All this time, while I was serving in Croatia, I have sought a way to serve your great and most felicitous majesty. It is for this reason that I gave up everything and became the Hungarian ambassador's steward, so that I could do what I had long desired, namely to serve your great and most felicitous majesty and adopt the Muslim faith." End quote. Mert here invokes the stock trope of the long and challenging quest to reach his new faith, although curiously, and I think this is a clue with a capital C, his declaration of political loyalty takes precedence over his wish to embrace the truth of Islam, even if the two clearly are no more than opposite sides of the same coin. Moreover, by invoking the trope of his quest, he emphasizes the long history of his sympathies with Islam, as if to contest the identification as a new Muslim, as which he would have doubtlessly been entered into the Ottoman registers. Interestingly, Mitrovitz perhaps unwittingly employed a rather similar pattern in the description of Mert as a villain without a moral compass and given to cruelty, disloyalty, and sensuality scattered throughout his memoirs. Apostatizing from the true faith was merely in keeping with his nature, or put slightly differently, given the negative stereotypes of the cruel and lustful Turk so common at the time, Mert already was inwardly Turkish before he outwardly turned Turk. Regardless of whether the former steward's claim that he had planned to become an Ottoman Muslim long before joining the imperial embassy is true, the rhetoric he employs is at least a tribute to the political and religious climate of his time. To Mert and his Christian European contemporaries, being Muslim meant being a Turk, that is to say, an Ottoman. As Christine Eisen-Verhaan has pointed out in the context of the Ottoman Empire and France, and I quote, "In the case of vital men in government service, conversion demonstrated a loyalty to the ruler, which was the key to the functioning of the state," end quote. And therefore, Tiana writes in her book, quote, "Conversion was a highly public and political statement rather than an individual or at best local communal affair," end quote. Religious affiliation thus acted as a marker of political loyalty, or at least gave rise to expectations of political loyalty by others. The kind of rhetoric employed in Mert's petition strikes at a central element of what confessionalization involves. Rivalries between opposing religious groups with claims to truth which they regard as absolute, universal, and exclusive manifested themselves as political antagonisms. Conversely, political rivalries were understood in terms of a religious struggle to such an extent that religious affiliation, political identity, and claims as well as expectations of political loyalty were nearly inseparable. In the religiously polarized climate of the 16th and early 17th centuries, rulers and political elites usually found it impossible to conceive of Jews and Muslims as loyal subjects of the Spanish crown, Calvinists as loyal subjects of the French king, and Catholics as loyal subjects of Queen Elizabeth I of England and her immediate successors. Instead, English Catholics, for instance, were constantly suspected of secretly working for the Pope and the King of Spain to undo the English Reformation. As for English Protestants, all Catholics were Papists, so throughout Europe, all Muslims were Turks. This is precisely why someone like Adam Neuser, whom we heard a lot yesterday, was regarded not just as a heretic and an apostate, but also as a traitor. From the Ottoman point of view, similar reservations applied. With few exceptions, membership in the Ottoman military administrative elite, and particularly access to offices within the empire's central administration, were reserved for Muslims from at least the 16th century onwards. This kind of religious exclusivism aimed at securing loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan provided the rationale for the Devshirme, which, with the exception of Bosnian Muslims, produced soldiers, officers, and officials who were converts to Islam. While the elite remained open to non-Muslims in certain sections, the case of the Austrian Christoph von Roggendorf, who defected to the Ottomans in 1546, also shows that such openness had limits. Although he was allowed to join the elite Mütteferrika Corps, Roggendorf's refusal to embrace Islam meant that he quickly hit the glass ceiling. After about a year, he defected once more out of sheer frustration, this time to the King of France. Carlo Gigalla, the younger brother of the well-known Italian-born Ottoman Admiral Gialazade Yusuf Sinan Pasha, likewise was unable to realize his ambitions in Ottoman service. Although Mehmed III issued a birat for his appointment to the Ottoman-controlled Duchy of Naxos as early as 1598, Carlo could never assume his position because he refused to fulfill the conditions of appointment, among them the demand that he become a Muslim. The confessionalization paradigm has, of course, been hotly debated, especially by German historians, ever since Wolfgang Reinhardt and Heinz Schilling first developed it in the early 1980s. And there has been significant resistance against extending it to regions outside Christian Europe. It is noteworthy, though, that most of the objections to Tiana's intriguing argument I've encountered from colleagues in Germany focus exclusively on the absence of a direct Islamic equivalent to the Holy Roman Empire's confessional churches, and the religiously pluralist makeup of Ottoman society as a whole. The relative tolerance towards non-Muslims in the Sultan's realm is usually regarded as entirely incompatible with the central idea of cuius regio, eius religio. And if I may add, the speed with which this objection is raised seems indicative of a primarily intuitive response. It is almost as if critics insist that confessionalization as a process can only exist if and when it targets the entire population. I'm skeptical that this is a fair expectation, even as far as Christian Europe is concerned. After all, confessionalizing efforts primarily target fellow Christians rather than, say, the Jews of Germany, even if, of course, the latter were frequently subject to missionary zeal and exclusion to the extent of expulsion. In any case, there were moments during which non-Muslims came under pressure to embrace Islam, as not only Tiana, but also Mark Baer have so recently shown. I would go slightly further than Tiana did in her book and provocatively venture the idea that in the context of relations between the Ottoman Empire and Christian Europe, Ottoman Sunni Islam to all intents and purposes functioned as an additional confession in opposition not merely to Safavid Shi'i Islam, but also to the various Christian confessions. While at this stage this is indeed an idea rather than a fully developed argument, it is based on a sense of theological familiarity and interaction supported by some of the contributions we heard yesterday, and of course the extent to which writers like Murad bin Abdullah engaged with Christianity in the defense of Islam, as well as the political role which religion played in the rivalries between the Ottoman and Habsburg empires. Moreover, in my opinion, the Shahada, as the crucial formula at the moment of conversion, gives Islam literally a confessional character, a fact which I don't think has received sufficient attention so far. From the point of view of Islamic theology and its relationship with the other religions of the book, such an interpretation seems entirely justified. Even if you disagree, though, there is no doubt that Murt's conversion took place in an environment which was politically as well as religiously polarized. And now I move on to another source. Murt's petition is not the only testimony which we have from the former steward. Among the dispatches in Vienna, there is also a copy of a private letter to a certain Hansel, which is signed with both Murt's Christian and Muslim names. This document presents us with a very different explanation of Murt's motivation to embrace Islam. As he tells Hansel, quote, "It is because of you that I have stayed in this country so that I could and will avenge you," end quote. In itself, defection in order to escape and possibly avenge a perceived grievance is of course a common motive. I've already mentioned Christoph von Roggendorf, who turned on Emperor Charles V because the latter had favored Roggendorf's wife in a legal dispute between the spouses. Likewise, in 1600, an entire garrison of Walloon mercenaries who were garrisoned in the Hungarian fortress of Papa went over to the Ottomans because the Habsburgs had repeatedly failed to pay them. In order to better understand what may have aggravated Ladislas Mört, we need to turn to the memoirs of Friedrich Seidel, who provides the most detailed report of the events leading up to the steward's defection and conversion to Islam. Evidently, Mört had been caught in the act while engaging in sexual intercourse with one of the embassy's kitchen boys. When Kreckwitz was informed of the incident, he had the steward confined to his room and the boy put into chains and locked up. It was in this situation that Mört escaped from the embassy. In Seidel's version of the story, moreover, the steward did not convert to Islam immediately, as he did in Mitrovitz's rendition, but only after he had been captured by a group of Janissaries sent out to return him to the embassy. Several days later, and this is confirmed by Friedrich von Kreckwitz's dispatches extant in Vienna, the convert returned to the embassy building in the company of several Tavushlar, with orders from the Grand Vizier to confiscate the correspondence between the ambassador and Vienna. Since Kreckwitz was unwilling to surrender his letters voluntarily and evidently certain that they had been hidden carefully, the Ottoman party began searching the chancery, where they eventually found a number of documents, most importantly a bundle of pages from Kreckwitz's protocols, which contained copies of all dispatches sent to Vienna since February of that year. So this is quite a substantial find and potentially at least quite dangerous. In addition, as Seidel recalls, Mört tried to liberate the kitchen boy, but had to abandon his attempts when he received a powerful rebuke from his erstwhile lover. Finally, during a shouting match with the ambassador, his former steward threatened him, quote, "You, Kreckwitz, you have made me a Turk. You shall pay for it with your head," end quote. That Mört subsequently labored to realize this threat is suggested by Kreckwitz's reports concerning the translation of his dispatches confiscated from the embassy. The ambassador, at least, was certain that the convert had a hand in translating them, even if only in the first step from German to Italian. By the time the translations were read out in the divan, they had been colorfully embellished and purported to show that, as Kreckwitz says, that Kreckwitz was working to poison Khoja Sinan Pasha, and with the help of numerous renegades set fire to the city of Constantinople in many places, and in particular to burn down the arsenal, end quote. Such stories sufficiently angered the Sultan that he immediately ordered Kreckwitz's execution, which was averted only because most members of the Divan seemed to have been more level-headed and advised that the matter be further investigated and the letters retranslated by somebody else. And notably, Khoja Sinan Pasha was not among those who seemed to have favored a retranslation. If Mört had spun an intrigue to have his erstwhile employer killed, he almost succeeded. When taken together, Mört's involvement in attempts to make Kreckwitz's life difficult, if not to end it entirely, as well as the correspondence between the events reported by Seidel and the details divulged in Mört's letter to Hansel, make it very tempting to conclude that Hansel is the kitchen boy whom Seidel identified as Mört's lover. This impression is further supported by the former steward's concern for Hansel's well-being, as well as the loving tone in which it is expressed. But even if Hansel and Mert were not lovers, the letter reveals a great deal about the former steward's take on religion. In a crucial passage, Mert invites Hansel to, quote, become a Turk, and reassuringly explains that God recognizes every man's heart. In the German original, Gott erkennt eines jeden Menschen Herz. I read this passage as Mert's attempt to reassure Hansel, and quite possibly himself, that it is possible to obtain salvation regardless of whether someone is Christian or Muslim. This statement, of course, could not be more at odds with the central Catholic dogma that there is no salvation outside the church, extra ecclesiam nulla salus, and please do remember that Seidel describes Mert as an ardent Catholic. Nor is it compatible with the exclusive claim to the final divine truth embodied in the revelation of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad. Rather, Mert here displays a certain religious pragmatism which appears to have been frequent even at the height of the age of confessionalization in Christian Europe as well as the Ottoman Empire. Busbek, for instance, credits Süleyman the Magnificent's famous Grand Vizier Rüstem Pasha with the statement, quote, I myself do not dissent from the doctrine that men who have passed this life in holiness and innocence will be partakers of eternal bliss, whatever religion they may have followed, end quote. For an equally pragmatic approach to religious affiliation in Christian Europe, one needs to turn only to someone like the Dutch scholar Justus Lipsius, who converted from Catholicism to Calvinism and back again. In both cases, considerations of career opportunities played a central role in religious conversion. Just to remind you, Rüstem Pasha was a product of the Defşehir Mir, his conversion to Islam therefore the result of an institutionalized and specifically Ottoman career path. While Lipsius's conversions were connected to teaching opportunities at universities in the Spanish Netherlands and the United Provinces, and indeed elsewhere in the Catholic countries of Europe. Like Rüstem and Lipsius, Mert can be considered religiously indifferent. This does not mean, as present-day usage of the word indifferent misleadingly suggests, that these men did not care about religion and religious and confessional differences, but they did consider these paths as equally valid roads towards God and salvation. Mert's testimony tells two apparently diametrically opposed stories. The rhetoric employed in his petition to Sultan Murad III draws on the vocabulary of confessionalization, in which religious and political polarization go hand in glove. His private letter to Hansel, in contrast, betrays an attitude of religious indifference in which adherence to any given religion is ultimately irrelevant for salvation. Religious indifference and religious polarization, and specifically confessionalization, are intimately linked. Admittedly, as Martin has highlighted, and I quote, indifferentism is the negation, the denial of everything which confessionalization efforts sought to achieve, end quote. This is correct, especially insofar as confessionalizing rulers and clerics sought to impose the uniformity of belief on the population of a given territory. In these settings, as the examples of northwestern Germany studied by Nicola Grochowina shows, religious indifference provided resistance to such attempts to the extent of a consciously deployed strategy. Yet the two basic outlooks were not entirely incompatible, in practice at least. In environments in which access to certain resources was restricted to members of a given religious group, indifferentism paradoxically served the politically motivated desire to establish homogeneity of religious affiliation. This is particularly true of appointments in state service, as the examples of Rüstem Pasha, Justus Lipsius, and even Ladislas Mert show. To be sure, their adherence to any one religion or confession may have been doctrinally superficial, but the mere fact of their conversion and outward membership in the dominant religious group served to confirm the dominance of that group and endowed it with further legitimacy. Conversion thus became not only a political act, but also served to symbolically communicate power. Of course, religious indifference also had a practical advantage for those of a more opportunistic streak of mind. If God recognizes every man's heart, it becomes theoretically easy to simply accept religious power relations and deal with them pragmatically without having to fear for one's soul. Having said this, Mert's case suggests that it was probably not all that easy in practice, that he was merely promised a timar grant after his conversion, for instance, rather than given an actual grant, may be a sign that Koca Sinan Pasha was wary of the sincerity of Mert's declaration of loyalty to Islam and the Sultan. But that is a topic for another paper. Thank you very much.
Martin Moser invited me to this conference. He had in mind that I will be talking about a certain Jakab Harsányi Nagy, a Transylvanian diplomat and Orientalist from the 17th century, about whom I defended a dissertation in this building some years ago. I hope I do not let him down entirely with having chosen another topic. I believe that the issues which motivated me to leave my comfort zone and move from the 17th century to the 16th are important enough for this conference. In the last 9 years, there has namely been a very strong thesis on the table concerning the relationship of Islam and Christianity in the very region we are talking about, the Ottoman-Habsburg context zone. Although having been first published in a not very well-known scholarly journal, the Journal of Unitarian Universalist History, the thesis of Susan Ritchie made a skyrocketing career, as much as it is possible in the field of East Central European early modern studies. Since it has been republished and made available in the internet, it became widely known and quoted among intellectual historians as well as students of Ottoman and Islamic studies. These not more than 18 pages seem to have revolutionized the way we think about the mutual influences between Islam and Christianity. As in this article, Dr. Ritchie suggests that the roots of the much celebrated, at least in Unitarian and United Hungarian circles, much celebrated Transylvanian religious tolerance should be found in the attitude of the Islamic Ottoman rulers towards their non-Muslim subjects. In the concluding remarks of the article, she goes even further, leaving the tight boundaries of the region, suggesting that John Locke must have had the Transylvanian example in mind when he wrote his seminal work on tolerance. Thus, European Enlightenment had Ottoman policies in its background and should to a certain level be seen as a joint Islamic-Christian endeavor. Needless to say, this conjecture was the one which received the greatest applause from post-colonial minded historians of political thought and accounts for a significant part of the paper's popularity. As the specific field and region she addressed is rather less known among the scholars of Reformation, a critical assessment of her thesis did, however, not take place. And this is what I aim to offer in the next 20 minutes. The thesis and argumentation of Dr. Ritchie can be reconstructed along the following lines. Being a Unitarian minister herself, she has been well acquainted with the traditional image of the so-called Edict of Torda, in which act John Sigismund, elected King of Hungary and Prince of Transylvania, declared in 1568 the fundaments of Transylvanian religious tolerance. Sorry, do you see it? In this legal act, as generations of historians put it before her, the prince laid the fundaments of the system of 4 acknowledged churches, which had later on been implemented during the entire existence of the principality. What is wrong with this image, and we will discuss later. She also mentioned that traditionally the legality of this legislation was explained by the Unitarian sympathies of the prince himself, and the man behind this act of toleration was identified in Francis or Ferenc David, the leader of anti-Trinitarians in Transylvania, as we can see in this wonderful picture of national romanticism style. The novelty of her thesis was to look at the background and find the overlord of the principality, the Sultan himself. Several other scholars had been tempted earlier to connect the Transylvanian developments to the well-documented toleration of the Ottomans towards the non-Muslim subjects of the empire, but no one identified such a clear cultural enmeshment between Islam and Christianity as Dr. Ritchie. She refers to general signs of cultural and social enmeshment, mentions examples of specific personalities whose career shows how it functioned, and in the last chapter, as the strongest argument beyond all general phenomena for her last thesis, traces correspondences in the metaphors used by the text of what she calls the Edict of Torda and an Edict of Toleration issued by a Pasha of Buda 20 years earlier. Let us start with the general level, because this is where I can share the largest part of Dr. Ritchie's opinions. As it may be well known, after the fall of the medieval kingdom of Hungary, after the Battle of Mohács in 26, yes, the country fell under the rule of 3 different powers, as we have seen on Robin's map yesterday, which was a much better map actually than this one. The western part maintained the traditions of the medieval kingdom as one of the territories ruled by the Habsburg dynasty, whereas the central part became integrated into the Ottoman provincial administration with the Beylerbey, or Pasha of Buda, as its supreme governor. The eastern half of the kingdom elected a king of its own from the local family of the Szapyais, a claim which after a while could only be upheld with Ottoman support. After much turmoil, this eastern Hungarian kingdom developed into the Principality of Transylvania, a tributary state of the Ottoman Empire, which sent its tribute to the Sublime Porte each year, and where rulers had to be acknowledged by the Sultan, and they had to send aid to Ottoman campaigns on request. This is the framework we should keep in mind. In Ottoman Hungary, there are quite obviously many traces of phenomena which derive from coexistence and which are presented by Dr. Ricci as signs of Islamic Christian cultural enmeshment. She claims, for instance, that a pamphlet of a Protestant author from the 16th century, Pál Túri Farkas, about the devious practices of the Turks, as he calls them, proves much less its intended message, which is quite clearly political, rather that intermarriages were taking place between Christian women and Muslim men, and one of the goals of Túri Farkas was actually to raise his voice against this practice. The surviving source material for 16th century social history of Ottoman Hungary is extremely meager, but Gabriele Erdei found some sources at the Roman office of Sacra Penitentiaria Apostolica, which offers several examples for exactly the same phenomenon. Obviously, always Christian women marrying Muslim men. And as far as I learned it only 2 days ago that she is preparing an English version, so it will be available for a larger public. If these cases indeed show a thriving cultural coexistence of the Christians and the Muslim population, which according to the analysis of tax registers mostly was limited to the military in Ottoman Hungary, is a question open for debate. However, what is more important for the current question is that this does not have much to say about the situation in Transylvania. Dr. Ricci shows on the example of a 17th century Transylvanian nobleman, Cosma Petrifi Horvat, in what an easygoing manner his ancestors were marrying spouses from different confessional groups. However, she finds no Muslim among them, and this is not a coincidence. It was a substantial part of maintaining the tributary status of Transylvania that no Ottoman army was permanently stationed in the Principality, and no Muslim population was allowed to settle in its territory. The same distinction should be made concerning the converts to Islam. Whereas their numbers remained, as far as we can judge, relatively small, they were present in Ottoman Hungary. Although in order to be able to identify them as signifiers of a cultural enmeshment, we should be familiar with their motivations to convert or their chances to keep their contacts to the group they came from, which is almost never the case. Muslims of Transylvanian origin, however, never had any influence or real influence upon the society and culture of the Principality, because the only way they could re-enter the country was if they sent there by the Sultan as emissaries, as Marcus Benkner, or soldiers of an invading army. So all in all, if we keep this map with distinctions in mind, we have to stress once more what Dr. Ricci leaves entirely out of sight, that although the supreme overlord of Transylvania was the Sultan, the impact of this upon the cultural and social structures of the country were minimal. And no matter how many signs we may identify for a cultural enmeshment in Ottoman Hungary, it has no relevance for Transylvania. The only way Transylvanians could have become acquainted with Ottoman religious tolerance was that not through personal experience, rather through reports coming from Ottoman Hungary, the same source that important religious reformers in Germany also had, as we heard from Mihály Balázs yesterday. Thus, with some exaggeration, we could say that if the cultural enmeshment between Muslims and Christians in Ottoman Hungary would have motivated the Prince of Transylvania to declare religious toleration, it should have had the same impact upon any German prince as well. In that case, they would also have borrowed the example of another country. Let us now turn to the strongest argument of Dr. Ricci, which goes beyond the level of drawing conclusions from the alleged general atmosphere of Christian-Muslim cultural enmeshment in the region, and tries to prove her point with identifying a possible direct antecedent of what she calls the Edict of Torda. She tells the story of an edict issued by the Pasha of Buda in 1548 20 years before the document in Torda, in which the Ottoman dignitary declared that, as it stands there, preachers of the faith invented by Luther should be allowed to preach the gospel everywhere to everybody, whoever wants to hear, freely and without fear, and that all Hungarians and Slavs, who indeed wish to do so, should be able to listen to and receive the word of God without any danger. As she rightly points out, this formulation, which shows connection between the act of hearing of Lord's word on one hand and faith on the other, shows remarkable similarity to what the Transylvanian legislation states 20 years later, in the somewhat inaccurate translation used by Dr. Ricci, because faith is a gift of God, it springs from listening, which listening forwards the word of God. This leads Dr. Ricci to the conclusion that the text of the so-called Edict of Torda must have been written with the Edict of the Pasha in mind, and she also dedicates considerable efforts to showing that Ferenc Dávid, who, as I mentioned before, according to her was the sole person responsible to write it, must have been familiar with the text. I would not dwell too much on Dr. Ricci's trivial mistakes, but some lines in her argumentation illustrate very well the general problems with her approach. She claims, for instance, that Dávid had to be aware of the Pasha's edict because his parish at Beszterce is much closer to Buda than Tolna, where Imre Szigeti, or Emericus Cigerius, lived, whose letter to Matthias Flacius is the only source we have about this edict of Buda. A single glance at the map shows that Beszterce is not only 3 times as far away from the old royal capital than Tolna, but it is also in another country. She also misjudges the territorial authority of Dávid's superintendency starting at 1557, when she claims that his right to be the head of administration for the Lutheran clergy derived directly from the Pasha's edict. Dávid namely became the superintendent of Magyar Lutherans in Transylvania, or rather the Eastern Kingdom, where the Pasha's rulings had no authority whatsoever. Thus, we cannot be sure that Dávid knew what the Pasha's edict stated. However, as it will turn out, it is not of great consequence, because it is much worse that we also cannot be sure what the Pasha's edict stated, if there was one edict at all. An original Ottoman Turkish text did not survive, but it does not say much. Apart from text registers, generally very few documents arrived from the Ottoman provincial administration. As I noted earlier, the only information we have about this act of legislation is the letter of Cigerius to Matthias Flacius Illyricus, in which he does not quote the document, only summarizes what the Pasha had ordered. This may have also been an oral order without any written form. Calling it an edict is actually only rooted in a historiographical accident. The 18th century church historian János Ribini had no access to this original Latin text of the letter, only to its 16th century German translation. So in his opus magnum, which he wrote in Latin, he translated the letter back to Latin, replacing the original verb mandavit to the term ediceret publice, thus suggesting a formal written order instead of a rather loose original formulation. Due to a lack of, and this was the version that already used until the second half of the 20th century when the original was discovered. Due to a lack of written original, we may thus never even have the theoretical chance to learn what exactly the Pasha ordered, although this would be extremely important for Dr. Ricci's thesis. Cigerius, namely, who had himself been a Lutheran preacher and an alumnus of Wittenberg, chose a formulation for summarizing the Pasha's order, which is quite distinctly biblical and enjoyed great popularity, exactly among early Lutherans. So then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God, as it stands in King James Bible. This biblical passage is exactly what the theologically minded authors of the Act of Legislation in Torda in 1568 chose to supplement their message with. It is probably needless to say that if a law of a Christian country at the Reformation period uses biblical formulation, it is a quite futile exercise to look for its roots in an order of an Ottoman dignitary, even if it was summarized by a Protestant preacher with a metaphor of similar roots. So much about philology. Let me summarize our results so far. Textual influence of a Pasha's edict upon the 1568 Act of Legislation in Torda can almost certainly be excluded. And even if there was a considerable grade of cultural enmeshment between Islam and Christianity in Ottoman Hungary, it was not meant to have a deeper impact upon the policies practiced in Transylvania than they had upon German territories. This surely does not exclude the possibility of influence. There simply exists no historical method that would be able to do so. However, let me call your attention upon a further aspect which is worth to note, the fundamental difference between the logic of the Ottoman religious toleration and the Transylvanian one. It has long been a debated question what the background of the well-documented benevolence of 16th century Ottoman dignitaries towards Protestant preachers was. I personally had been convinced by an institutional political interpretation that we also heard from Mihály Balázs yesterday, which emphasizes that the Ottoman power needed to consolidate its rule and make sure that taxpayers remained in their places. For this, in the Balkans, they created a modus vivendi with the remaining Orthodox Church administration. In 16th century Hungary, however, it was the Protestants who seemed to be enjoying popularity among the majority of population. As Antal Molnár, perhaps the best expert on missionaries in Ottoman Balkans and Hungary, noted, in the early 17th century, when Catholic missionary activities started in the Ottoman territories, they had the same positive experiences as the Protestant preachers directly after the conquest, only to be replaced by much more problems with Ottoman authorities in the second generation, again following the Protestant example from decades before. This surely does not exclude the possibility that several Ottoman dignitaries might have had personal interest in the quarrels of the Christians. One thing, however, should be recalled. In each case, they were dealing with the adherents of another religion, which meant no danger to their own confessional group. Christians could maintain their own faith and convert from one denomination to the other at will, but it was clearly not an option to convert from Islam to Christianity. This was beyond the boundaries of Ottoman tolerance as well. Quite different was the situation in Transylvania. Recent research, primarily by Mihály Balázs, I always have to quote him, and Ildikó Horn, has shown that much has to be reconsidered of the well-established old image concerning the Edict of Torda. First of all, the edict was even less an edict than that of the Pasha of Buda. Although confirmed by King John Sigismund, the text comes from the Acts of the Diet, which literally is written in the form of the estates asking the ruler to implement some rules. A number of other sources also suggest that this act of legislation, which excludes the persecution of preachers for their teachings, was more the result of the estate's demands than the will of the ruler. Thus, it cannot be considered an edict of John Sigismund. Its main goal was not, as traditionally alleged, to create, for the priests of the realm, a balance between the four established churches, much less so as these did not yet exist. The anti-Trinitarian branch did not yet leave the framework of the Calvinist Church, and the few remaining Catholics of the country had more or less lost their church infrastructure altogether in the preceding decades. In a study which has also been published recently in an English version, again, Mihály Balázs has compared the text of the laws from this diet to the legislation concerning religion from the surrounding years, and convincingly shown that the aim of the act actually was to provide legal background to one of the most important claims of the Reformation, the deconstruction of limits in searching for and preaching the divine truths. Instead of finding the good of the realm in not intervening in religious matters, as the Ottomans did, it theoretically aims, using a biblical language, at creating a framework for the establishment of a Protestant country. Although Catholics are not mentioned here in the Torda text, but already in the next year, this decree is confirmed together with another one against idolatry, which is a nickname for Catholicism in the Protestant language of the age. And if the contemporaries had no problem acknowledging them together, it means that the Torda legislation was not meant to be favoring the Catholics. The full system of four recepti religiones, including the Catholics, was only codified almost 30 years later in 1595, as a result of the patience and negotiation skills of the successive Catholic princes from the Báthory family. But even at that point, the logic of the system was profoundly different from the Ottoman one. With acknowledging three other possible Christian denominations, each prince and each member of the estates were putting the religious convictions of their own group to risk, which was never the case in the Ottoman world. Taking all of these together, I would dare to say that the establishment of religious toleration in Transylvania can be better understood as a result of decades of political fine-tuning than as a joint Muslim-Christian endeavor. Thank you for your attention.
This piece of information, besides showing Paolo Giovio's, the area's most popular historian's interest in Hungarian affairs, naturally places both the addressee and the writer of the letter in the Italian-spirited cultural atmosphere formed by Hungarians having visited Italy and Dalmatian intellectuals in Hungary at the beginning of the 16th century. The two correspondents, Tamás Nádasdy, who had studied in Bologna, Padua, and Rome, and Tranquillo Andreis, born in the Dalmatian trough, undoubtedly belonged to this circle. This must have strongly reminded Tamás Nádasdy of the famous Venetian, friend of Giovio and Andreis, who had used to be a strong ally of Nádasdy himself when he had been an enemy of the Habsburgs a decade ago. When Tamás Nádasdy read his letter, he must have thought of Alvise Gritti, Gritti Lajos, as he was called in Hungary, the Istanbul-born Venetian regent of King János I, Szapolyai, representing Ottoman interest, even if he thought was extremely unpleasant for him at the end of the 1540s. The author of the letter, Tranquillo di Andreis, was Gritti's Latin secretary between 1529 and 1534, whereas Nádasdy was his Hungarian deputy, locum tenens gubernatoris, allowed to act in all issues from 12 January 1531 to 15 October 1532. Tamás Nádasdy was fully aware of the fact that Paolo Giovio, a collector of portraits of famous people of the area, deeply respected Gritti, on whom Nádasdy did not even want to think after so many years. The irony is that Gritti's portrait may still be in the Museum of Como as the only portrait of Hungarian connection of the once famous but now destroyed and scattered Museum Jovianum. The other Hungarian paintings have been lost. The figure of Regent Gritti went down in Hungarian historic memory as a malevolent adventurer seeking to destroy Hungary, as a Levantine merchant finding financial gain in the crisis of the country. Many people were of the view that the Ottomans placed him in Hungary as a third king besides King János and Ferdinand. It would be interesting to know how this unambiguous rejection came to be. Was he received with antipathy at the very beginning, or were there people who liked him? Or was he only defamed after his death? Only those Hungarians could answer these questions who knew him as closely as Tamás Nádasdy did. Nádasdy had a highly controversial connection with Gritti. The Hungarian aristocrat ended his friendship with the Venetian merchant very abruptly and spectacularly, among almost theatrical circumstances. I would here like to reinterpret the meaningful cooling off of this friendship in the light of old Hungarian and recent international research. The history of the relationship of Gritti and Nádasdy is richly documented, and Hungarian scholarly literature tried to analyze it several times. It seems, however, that a better understanding of the problem has been prevented by the scatteredness of Gritti research and its over-enclosure into Hungarian national tradition. Gábor Barta, author of an excellent biography of Gritti, explicitly states that his research does not include the extra-Hungarian events of the Venetian adventurer's life. This is, although to more limited extent, is also true for the other Hungarian studies on Gritti. The Hungarian historical area that may be characterized by Gritti's name can hardly be understood without the analysis of more extended international connections. I hope that certain aspects of the recent Italian and especially Turkish research, now concentrating only on the episodes of the relationship between Gritti and Tamás Nádasdy, will shed new light also on Gritti's role in Hungary. The beginning and the end of the cooperation of Gritti and Nádasdy are marked by two symbolic, exciting, and almost novel-like events. Both were often retold by many. Nevertheless, the complicated logic of developments makes it necessary to talk about them again. In the summer of 1529, the armies of Sultan Suleiman I arrived in Hungary. The Ottoman ruler put King János on the throne, occupied Buda, and continued towards Vienna. As a captain of King Ferdinand's, Tamás Nádasdy defended the castle of Buda and allegedly showed his determination by hanging a pitch-covered coffin at the top of the castle, meaning to say that he would rather die than surrender. The German mercenaries, however, handed the castle over despite the captain's order, so the captain had to flee, but where could he go? He sought refuge with Gritti, who had just arrived with the armies of the Sultan, who saved his life, hid him in his tent for days, and persuaded him to join him and King János. Nádasdy's excellent knowledge of Italian, his smartness and quick adaptability would not be enough for him to reconcile so fast and efficiently with his former enemies. There must have clearly been a very deep agreement on the current political status in Gritti's stand between the Hungarian aristocrat and the Italian politician and former merchant financier. And now, let us jump ahead in time. In December 1532, right after the Sultan's new campaign against Vienna had been ultimately stopped at the small castle of Kőszeg, Günz, and most of the Turkish army had left the country, Tamás Nádasdy and his followers in Buda mercilessly ridiculed Gritti, who was in Belgrade at that time. His tax collector was stolen, and Gritti's already low reputation was damaged by a noisy trúfa. According to an almost contemporary account by György Szerémi, I quote, news was spread that the Turkish emperor had given orders to have the governor skinned in Constantinople, then had his skin stuffed with straw and hung from a tower, end of quote. In his now classic ingenious study on Gritti, Tibor Kardos comments that the essence and turning point of the Buda trúfa, Magnus Ludus, must have been the defamation of a straw figure depicting Gritti, publicly ridiculing the Italian habits of the regent. We know that when Gritti returned to Buda, he cruelly revenged the practical joke while Nádasdy himself fled. Although Nádasdy officially only returned to King Ferdinand on 6 August 1534, not long before Gritti's execution in Mátyás. The 1532 Magnus Ludus in Buda put an end to the once promising friendship of Gritti and Nádasdy. The phases of their friendship between these two significant events have been rather well explored by Hungarian research, minutely describing Nádasdy's gradual moving away, than his more and more definite aversion to Gritti's personality and politics. Nádasdy's changes of allegiance are usually counted among the known behavior patterns of Hungarian aristocrats hesitating between János and Ferdinand. However, Nádasdy's case is special. No matter how many times he changed fields, he never lost his extreme huge political influence, rank, or fortune. Along with Tamás Nádasdy, Hungary itself, and it is not an exaggeration, the whole contemporary world made a very big turn. We cannot understand this without deeper knowledge of Gritti's role in international politics. Hungarian scholarly literature is aware of the fact that Alvise or Lavise or Lodovico Gritti, born in Istanbul as an illegitimate son of Venetian Doge Andrea Gritti, and the Greek mother, had studied in Padua, but later returned to his birthplace Istanbul, where he managed to create an extreme influence in the port as a very rich merchant and of jewelry. His Italian friends, Pietro Aretino and the above-mentioned Paolo Giovio, kept praising his culture and intelligence. Gritti was fluent in Italian, Turkish, and Greek, but he also had deep knowledge of Latin culture. In Galata, quarter of the Ottoman capital, inhabited by Christians, he had a pompous palace of Italian tastes with many slaves, a harem, and a wonderful stables. In his residence, he directed popular Italian plays. He had luxurious receptions where he invited Christians and Turks alike. As a favorite of the famous Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, also of Greek origin from the Venetian terra firma, Gritti played an increasing role in the Western politics and occupation plans of the Ottoman Empire. The Grand Vizier Ibrahim was completely under Gritti's influence, according to gossip. Ibrahim Pasha was named Grand Vizier in 1523, the year when Alvise's father, Andrea Gritti, became the Doge of Venice. From that point on, Alvise was nicknamed Beyoğlu, son of the Prince of Venice. The meaning of Beyoğlu is son of the Prince of Venice in Istanbul. Gritti primarily represented Venetian interests at the port, but in the 1520s it became obvious that he was the only way to the Sultan. Sultan Süleyman himself was a frequent guest in Gritti's palace. The Sultan was an admirer of luxury and arts, and he increased his famous collection of ancient gems with the help of Gritti. Gritti was considered a half Turk by many, considering that he followed Turkish habits and wore Turkish clothes. In reality, however, he was a faithful Christian who went to church regularly and even signaled this status with his typical Italian berretta, Ghibellin hat. It is less known in Hungary that, according to his father's Francophile politics, Alvise Gritti was in contact with all European powers willing to oppose the ever-growing force of the Habsburgs. The Porte was very worried by the defeat of the League of Cognac and the Treaty of Cambrai, so the Ottoman Empire, at the peak of its power, prepared an attack of unseen force against the Christian world. They planned to simultaneously attack Austria through Hungary and Italy via the sea. Following the Ottoman victory, Italy would have been divided into two under an Ottoman protectorate. The northern part would belonged to the French king, Francis I, while an Ottoman vassal state would have been created in the south under the governance of Alvise Gritti himself. The European enemies of the Habsburg and the pro-Christian leaders Ibrahim, Pasha and Alvise Gritti, determining the politics of the Ottoman Empire, envisioned a new reformed Roman Empire, clean set of religious differences, organized from Istanbul, the second Rome, ruled by the Ottoman Sultan. The sea attack against Italy, however, never took place. It would not have served the interest of either Venice or the French, but Europe experienced the threatening Ottoman military preparations as a real danger. Many people, among them such intellectuals as Paolo Giovio and Pietro Aretino, saw Gritti as the future Prince of Italy. The plan was an embodiment of the peculiar concepts and secret wishes of Grand Vizier Ibrahim and Gritti. Venice had long since lost its former status, a significant power. Its land territories, the terra firma, were threatened by the Habsburg, so it leaned more and more on the Ottoman Empire in its foreign policy. The Signory of Venice had a cautious and two-timer policy, and it did not mind regaining its Mediterranean influence with the help of Ottoman arms and victories. Gritti's regency in Hungary was one of the branches of this enormous military plan, including half of Europe. The sweeping Ottoman attack against Austria indeed took place in 1532. The military campaign was made really menacing and impressive through exceptionally rich forms of power representation. Research hardly or not at all known in Hungary by Guru Necipolu, a famous Harvard scholar of Islamic art, explored the history in precise iconography of the beautiful headpiece made in 1532 by Venetian goldsmiths for the Sultan and put on display on the Rialto. The Ottoman Sultan's treasury paid 500 ducats for the crown, decorated with 50 diamonds, 47 rubies, 27 emeralds, 49 pearls, and a gigantic Turkish stone. The huge and extremely rich headpiece tried to outweigh the crowns of all other nations and powers in beauty and glory. The 4 crowns attached to it clearly referred to the wish that the 3 crowns of Mehmed the Conqueror be accompanied by a 4th one on the Sultan's head. The form of the headpiece unmistakably and simultaneously suggested the papal tiara and the Holy Roman Emperor mitre crown together. The Venetian-made Ottoman helmet crown played a significant role in the triumphs of ancient spirit organized in all bigger towns on the way to Vienna to honor Suleiman the Magnificent. The peak of these events would have been the Sultan's entry in Vienna, which never took place because of the failure in Kőszeg and several other reasons, of course. One of the most interesting and, as far as we are concerned, most important observations of Necipolu is that the idea, plan, and artistic program of the headpiece was entirely Alvise Gritti's invention, to use Paolo Giovio's expression. Thus, Gritti was not only first class in forming world politics, but also an artist of representation of power. What can we say in the light of all this, of Gritti's and Nadasdy's above detailed friendship that soon turned into controversies? In 1529, hiding in Gritti's tent, talking to the Doge's son for several days, Nadasdy must have himself believed that the regency of the Venetian merchant will soon make Hungary and Italy's most beautiful dreams come true. Hungary will reunite, even if with the help of Ottoman arms. Venice will get rid of the dreaded Habsburg, and maybe both countries will be ruled by Gritti, the Renaissance prince. Most probably, Nadasdy was already offered the post of vice-regent, which seemed highly promising in this perspective. Probably neither of them had much respect of King János Szapolyai, and they certainly did not believe that the country could reunite under his crown, King János. And they were not mistaken. Although Gritti had many enemies in Hungary, at this point many people, not only Nadasdy, placed high hopes in him. Despite the fact that he spent most of his short governorship regency in Istanbul, he produced spectacular economic results, invested in the Hungarian mining industry, and achieved brave military and political deeds. For instance, he personally took part in the defense of Buda and allowed Hungarian serfs to move. It is worthwhile to mention that even the often biased George Szerémy says in his memoirs that Gritti wished to develop the Hungarian capital, I quote, with commerce so that Buda could become one of a kind. Everyone was fascinated when Gritti went somewhere in Buda behind his bodyguards dressed in Renaissance clothing full of feathers. In Gritti's plans, Buda was almost an ideal city of Italian Renaissance, glittering with gold. Let us create another small Italy in Buda, one similar to that of King Matthias Corvinus. This idea must have thrilled Tamás Nadasdy for a moment. By the time of the Magnus Ludus in December 1532, Nadasdy's enthusiasm was completely gone. The whole country witnessed one of Sultan's latest spectacular failure at Kőszeg, near the city of Vienna. In Hungary, the Ottoman Sultan stopped organizing triumphs of ancient spirit. The Ottoman army approached Vienna via unusual military routes. Gritti's helmet crown was evidently saved for celebration following the final victory. We can only guess whether Nadasdy heard of the crown designed by Gritti. It is, however, sure that he was aware of the reasons that caused Gritti's crown to evoke bad memories for the Ottomans. That is why the headpiece never became a part of the Sultan's official representation. The Magnus Ludus did not make fun of the Doge's son for his failures in Hungary, but suggested that the Venetian may soon lose the Porte's friendship. And this was indeed true. Many scholars have analyzed the reasons of the 1532 failure of the Ottoman army in Kőszeg, but few looked for inner reasons besides the external ones to explain why the Sultans reckoned from the final battle with the Habsburgs. By that time, the Ottoman enemies of Grand Vizier Ibrahim and Alvise Gritti had become very strong at the port. This was not a simple inner fight at the Divan. It was rather about the fact that the Ottoman opposition to Gritti's politics was unwilling to help anti-Habsburg, strong Christian princes reach the throne at the border of the empire. This would have endangered the Islamic character and religious aims of the Ottoman Empire and would have caused political insecurity. The Turkish leaders in Istanbul must have thought that the Ottoman Empire had had dangerously too many victories. They did not want to hand over the fruits of the glorious campaign of the Islam to renegades and yaours. In Istanbul, Gritti's helmet crown was not even considered an Ottoman symbol of power. Its form, character, and message only conveyed Gritti's and Ibrahim Pasha's political concepts, expectations, and plans to the Christian world. Not many people noticed that in the winter of 1532, this plan was already a thing of the past. It is not by chance that Gritti and Ibrahim were primarily blamed in Istanbul for Christianizing the court. One of the important reasons of Ibrahim Pasha's downfall was the fact that the Grand Vizier's representation of power was considered anti-Islam. It is well known that Ibrahim placed the Renaissance statues. Okay. Yeah. The Renaissance statues depicting Hercules, Apollo, and Diana, taken from the Buddha Palace of King Matthias Corvinus in the Hippodrome of Constantinople. His enemies wrote and distributed the pasquin on him. There were two Abrahams on earth, Ibrahims on earth. One demolished idols, the other erected them. Recent Turkish research suggested that this gesture countering Islamic traditions was suggested by Alvise Gritti, who, as a Venetian, was well aware of the significance of similar symbolic theft of works of art, spolia. He knew very well that Venice had stolen the famous bronze horses decorating the pediment of St. Mark's Basilica from Constantinople during the 1204 crusade. The Grand Vizier had less and less space of breath. As Ibrahim Pasha was slowly pushed into the background and fell out of grace, Gritti's failure was also inevitable. In 1534, the Venetian merchant made a last attempt to create an Eastern European Christian empire from King János Hungary and the Romanian principalities. He would have given the crowns of Moldavia and Wallachia to his sons, Antonio and Pietro, and he would have taken the Hungarian crown himself. The Porte made no movements to prevent the allied armies of the three countries involved to entrap, overcome, and behead the Venetian adventurer. Tamás Nádasdy recognized this very early. Even if he had believed that Gritti would be capable of recreating Hungarian Renaissance, these dreams quickly evaporated. He had to realize that the Turks had no interest to reuniting Hungary. He also understood that his country would remain divided for a very long time, and he had to stay with the Habsburg ruler. He must live where he belongs by his personal ties, family relation, and domains in western part of the country. That is his Sárvár castle. Nádasdy was among the first to realize that Hungary needs clever, rich, and experienced aristocrats like him to stay alive. Renaissance ideas have not entirely disappeared from his life. They simply transformed or narrowed. They were enclosed into the gardens of the country homes among the flower beds. But as Nádasdy Tamás tasted the octopus, the frozen fish, the caviar, the lemon, the olives, the figs and pistachio flavors Malvasia wine ordered from Italy, as he read Paolo Giovio's book, he must have sought his former regent, the Venetian Alvise Gritti, especially if he had been benevolently warned to do so in a letter. Thank you for the attention.
Yes. I can start even without the maps. First of all, thank you very much. I'm saying this to the organizer to accepting my application. It's a great honor and possibility to actually test one of my hypotheses, because actually I wrote my PhD dissertation on political theology, not in the Carl Schmittian sense, but in how 16th and early 17th century Hungarian Protestant reformers conceptualized political power, social relations, traditional questions like obedience, resistance, and all these rather classical issues. And within this framework, obviously, I couldn't avoid the question of the Turk, even if I wanted to avoid. But if you're a Hungarian historian, at some point in your life, you have to face the Turk. Another question is a nation, but that's a different conference. So this is first of all a work in progress, actually quite long now, and also I'm gonna reveal the weak points of my argument, so I'm gonna help you. The second point I want to make, that I'm not dealing with the social history. It's very important, the background, and I'll try to somehow reveal, shed light on the context, but I'm not a researcher of the social or institutional history, even if it's inevitable, so you cannot get it away. The other last remark of mine, I wanted to present here something about confessional writings, but I saw in the program that many people are referring to certain texts like letters like Tigerius and Turi and others, so I'm gonna describe, or at least dive into a bit of those texts as well. Last but not least, I also have to admit, I have to start with Luther, not because it's real fashionable, but not because I'm really interested in Luther, but his approach is really crucial for these issues, at least topically. What we know, and I'm sorry for those who know much more about Luther than I do, so I'm preaching to the convert. And also I'm sorry for the Hungarians who know much more I do about these issues, but I try to put this together and let's see if it works or not. As we know, lately from Thomas Kaufmann and others, so like there's a vast literature on this, that Luther preached from Daniel, chapter 7 of Daniel, and John's Revelation, that the Turks, as Gog and Magog, would overrun Europe and establish themselves in Germany and Italy by 1600. Thus Luther and his followers viewed contemporary events as an eschatological struggle between God and the devil, Satan, and their representatives, the false church, the papacy, Anabaptists, and Turks on the one hand, and the true church of God on the other, namely the Lutherans. Luther believed that the end of the world is close as the signs are apparent in the behavior of the papacy and the Turkish expansion in Eastern Europe. The real threat, however, for Luther was the Roman Curia, which was more tyrannical in his eyes than the Turks, because it subjugated the church to the false doctrine on the first hand, on the other, it subjugated the soul of man and not the flesh of the man. So there's that kind of distinction. But both are antichrist for Luther. In the early 20s, however, there was some shift in the late 20s, there was a shift in Luther understanding, which I'm not going into. But most importantly, Luther did not support the plans of the papacy to launch any crusade against the Turks, whom he considered to be the scourges and the rod of God, flagella et virgam Dei, because thereby, he claimed, they would ignore God's attempt of righteously punishing our wickedness. So obviously, God has a pedagogic, or how to say, approach with the Turk on Christianity to show our sins. I quote, "If we must have any Turkish war, we ought to begin with ourselves. Therefore Christians should rather pray, repent, and return to the right doctrine." Why this is important? Because the early Hungarian Reformation sort of accepted this rather pacifist approach, but it's more complicated. I'm going to get into it. On the other hand, we can know for sure that there is no coherency in Luther's theology. So under pressure of the papal accusations and excommunication, his excommunication later, he modified his view, saying that his previous article did not mean that the Christians are not to fight against the Turks, but first they should mend their ways. And he accepted the military reaction, but not as a religiously legitimized crusade, but as a sort of secular war. And I think this is very, very important. Which gonna be this argument has a crucial role in my thesis. And later on his work on the Vom weltlicher Obrigkeit, the worldly magistrate, he still not considered any crusade legitimate, but accepted the necessity of military response after unsuccessful peace negotiations. And also later he said that just war is possible against foreign invaders, but not, he claimed, as lawbreakers, just like against any domestic ones. And he also approved service in a war against the Turks, but he did not accept any personal vengeance and definitely not any religious crusade. So what he said that the emperor should be the leader of the defensive war, but not as the defender of faith, but as the defender of the country, of the imperium, to prevent useless bloodshed and lost wars. So his approach is rather practical. So he distinguishes pretty much, I would say, the Zweireiche. But this is the next problem, because somehow Luther theology is always around the Zweireiche teaching, which is very complicated because it means many things, definitely not coherently. In one aspect, it means the two governments by which God governs the world, like the worldly magistrate and the church. In other aspects, in other writings, that's rather between God's kingdom and the devil's kingdom. In other aspects, this is in other writings, this is rather about the position of the Christian in the world, like the different spheres he lives in. And also he's not really coherent in, so the literature also saying that this is something, difficult to catch. But definitely, and this is really important, in his political theology, there is an important statement, as opposed actually to Calvin and Melanchthon and others, that he kept for quite long a claim for the division between the Zweireiche, between the worldly magistrate as a secular and the church as a different jurisdiction. And this is really important, and I don't want to get into detail, but for my side, that he basically claimed that a Christian ruler has rather duties about the social security and how to say the equilibrium and the peacefulness of the society. So even when he claims that the princes should punish the Anabaptists, he claims that it's not because they are heretic, but because they undermine the social order. Actually, it's not Luther who transgresses this border between the two spheres, but the Anabaptists did it. And actually, it's really interesting. There's a new interpretation of Luther political theology, James Estes from Toronto, that basically Luther, until the very end, as opposed to actually Melanchthon, kept this kind of division much more than later Calvin. And we get into that other problem here, as the relation between caution and faith, so power and faith. And why is this important? Because, like for Melanchthon, for instance, he claimed that the ruler is the guardian of the two tables of the commons. Luther never claimed in such an obvious way. He sort of tended to separate this. Why is this important? Because this functional separation is very useful for the Hungarian reformers living under the Turk. And I finish here, Luther, let me go to a couple of sources and letters, I promised. Melanchthon, actually in 1541, was informing Goldstein in Wittenberg in a letter that the Turks did not trouble the Protestants in Buda. When the teacher was called by the Turkish magistrate, the prefect, and asked what he was teaching to Christians, he explained the judgment of the gospel, that the gospel showed the difference between the church and the empire, and that the Christians and the Protestants do not support and initiate any sedition. As a result, the Turkish prefect was satisfied according to Melanchthon's letter, and he let the teacher leave safely, and he was actually satisfied, the Turkish, actually the Qadi. In Melanchthon's interpretation, he explained that the Articles of the Christian faith rightly teaches that the true church should be distinguished from the worldly power, from imperium, so it encourages the citizens to obey the present magistrates and does not promote any sedition. So according to the Turkish magistrate was tolerant, if not supportive of the Protestant faith, because he could expect obedience from the Protestants. What is important here that the source of Melanchthon letter is obviously some Hungarian source, we don't really know, like students or whoever, but it's really important that this is the perspective. There is some neutrality. If the Protestants respect his position as someone ordered by God, actually, either a divine punishment or something else, we should accept his position as long as he doesn't comment anything to God. And this is really important here, because there are a couple of writings, Luther actually suggests that the criteria of obedience is not the face of the ruler, but the nature of his command. So even if the ruler is not Christian, but if he commands something which is not against the law or nature or God's law, we should be obedient. But if it's not against God's commands, we are not supposed to be obedient. It doesn't matter whether it's a Turkish, a non-Christian or a Christian, even against Christian magistrate, we should resist, at least we should be disobedient. And he even mentioned in the table talks and other writings that there is a job and duty of the magistrate, which is nothing else than bridle the human sin in society and prevent the human society turning into chaos. That's the job of the magistrate. If this is a Turk or a pagan vice magistrate, that's very good as long as we can live with our good faith, true faith. So this is really, I mean, that's one of my core arguments, because it seems that the Hungarian reformers, even if it's really obvious that the Melanchthon influence on the Hungarian Reformation, especially Lutheran, but the Calvinists, I mean the Reformed as well, as if Melanchthon had a much stronger influence, but it seems that in this respect, for an obvious reason of the context, the Hungarian reformers rather followed Luther, otherwise not really obvious understanding. Why I'm saying this, because okay, I'm gonna get into later details. On the other hand, and I have to skip here a couple of parts. We know that there are a couple of reports. Professor Mihály Balázs also mentioned that there are cases when Protestants are debating, Protestants and like Catholics and Protestants, or Anabaptist, Unitarians and Catholics, Unitarians and Reformed, and they go to the Turkish Qadi in the occupied territories. Actually, I didn't really went on in this region. Torna is here, where Tigris wrote his letter. So this is the occupied territory, and actually the Turkish magistrate made some decisions. There are very interesting cases. Professor Balázs in his book describes in detail that when Unitarians and Catholics went to the Qadi, and they tried to provoke each other to raise issues in which, for instance, the Turkish Qadi was more favorable on their side. For instance, about the Holy Trinity. Obviously, the Qadi supported the Unitarians, but when it came to the issues of ceremonies, which the Unitarians denied, then obviously he supported the Catholics, and also about celibacy and other issues. So but it's an interesting thing. So there are reports actually when it's really happening, it's going on. The reliability of these sources are rather questionable in many cases, but actually it's really interesting. Before going into details of this report, actually, I just wanna concentrate on these two sources mentioned before by Gábor, Cigérius letter and the other one, because I think it's really crucial in this respect. And okay, I'm sorry, and also mentioned that there are debates, interestingly enough, in which, for instance, between Protestants and Catholics, and they brought their case before the Pasha, who actually said that he was not there to decide their debate, but to preserve the reign of the emperor, Regnum Caesaris, of the Turk, of course, if possible, in tranquility. So in the sources, pretty often there is a neutral role attributed to the Turkish. Not always, but there are certain types of sources in which it's quite neutral. And there are decisions, and some part is happy, the other is not that happy, or not at all. So there is this kind of practical toleration, at least in one stream of the sources. The problem is there are other streams of the sources. And also in the old historiography, partially based on these sources, but on other Protestant sources, there used to be an understanding, a view that the Turkish was pro-Protestant in many aspects, in many regions, especially because they prefer the Protestants to the Catholics, because they didn't have connection to the Habsburgs that strongly. They were anti-German, how to say it, so in the old historiography they claim this, and also the Reformed churches has a more Puritan outlook, not having altar pictures, pieces, whatever. But this kind of view is sort of, how to say, outdated nowadays, because it was always on the situation, on the case. And also there's another view, is rather of church historians claiming that the Turk was very cruel, and they also quoted many sources when Protestant ministers were beaten up, tortured, even hanged or killed, without any apparent reason. And that stream of literature claiming that the Turk is always an alien and distant and cruel and unreliable. So, and there's a new understanding. Ferenc Szakály, Professor Balázs, and Pálfodor also belong to this sort of new school, third position, saying that the Turk was neither hostile nor tolerant toward the Protestant out of principle, but rather treated them in such a way as to keep the infidels from fleeing away in order to keep the tax-paying population. And they, I wouldn't say neutral, but rather practical. The biggest problem is here that the sources are actually never neutral sources. So always one of the sides reports the case, and it's used in a way which cannot be neutral in a sense. The Cigerius case is really interesting. Cigerius, who was a schoolmaster in Tolna, a student of Flacius for many years, and he sent a letter to Flacius, as Gábor also mentioned. And accordingly, the Pasha of Buda allows the free preaching of the gospel and even provides protection against the Catholic Church. Flacius published in German and Latin. And what is really interesting, that what was Flacius' purpose behind this, with his publication, he actually claimed in the preface that it was to give example of the divine providence and provide a contrast to his contemporaries, including the princes and theologians, the interimists and the adiaphorists. So Flacius actually didn't really support the reconciliation attempts, the interim. And therefore he tried to show the Catholics that they should treat the Protestants as gently as the Turks treated the Hungarian Protestants in Hungary. So you should learn, you Catholics, that the Turks are even better than you. In his preface, he wrote that his first reason was to show that the Sardinic Christians, that the Lord miraculously protects and maintains his miserable people, just as he will protect us against the gates of hell. His second reason was that the Christian potentates should be embarrassed and ashamed that the Turkish lords tolerate the ministers of Christ better than many in Germany. This actually is one of the biggest problems. I guess Márton received many letters from Hungarians, even many students there, and he published, to my knowledge, only this one. So you can imagine, maybe other letters had different opinion. So it's obviously that this is a letter published by Flacius, which was written by a Hungarian Protestant who had also some project or mission, you know, or something to tell to Márton. So the information is very indirect. So there are many stages, so we get that. And obviously one of the reasons why actually Gábor made a very nicely elaborated claim that it's not really, how to say, reliable information about how really things happened. But what is important that there is one Hungarian Protestant who wanna represent the situation like this. So in terms of representativeness, is informative. And there's also one thing Gábor didn't mention. This is problematic. It was mentioned about the Slavic mission of the early Protestant reformers. I don't want to get into detail, but it's really funny that the same text, in the Ribini translation, Ribini cuts the sentences into two pieces, and he claims that the Hungarians and the Slavic people listened freely to the gospel. In the original, this is part of the Pasha's command. I'm not saying that Staroy and reformers, he didn't preach in Slavic language, for instance, Croatians. the gospel. But this is one of the most important sources, especially for Croatian historiography, that there was a Croatian Reformation in this region by Hungarians. One of the interesting things, okay, there are many Croatian reformers, but these two, like Staroy and Cigerius, published things in Hungarian Latin, but nothing in Croatian. I'm not an expert on that, but I have some doubts about this. And also other problem that in this similar letter, he claims that Staroy established 120 congregations between down to Mösia. What is Mösia? I mean, it's either in the Balkan or in Minor Asia. If it's Minor Asia, then it's a wishful thinking that it's rather a plan that we should spread the gospel among the Turks. I'm just saying this, that this is the level of reliability of the sources in this respect. But what I'm trying to use it rather for what they wanted to project, what they wanted to persuade the readers about. And the other, and I don't know how much time I have left with, what is really interesting here, and it's rather contradictory in many of these sources, that for their position, certainly they claim a neutral position. So the Turkish magistrate can be neutral, that's why we can live under him. But when they go to the Qadi, the magistrate, they don't request a neutral decision, rather a biased decision. You should help us to defend our true faith against the others. So many times it's really, really interesting. So you understand there's kind of contradiction within the sources. And the other sources, this Farkas Pálturi Idea Christianorum, I think I'm really running out of my time just mentioning one thing. This is a really negative view of the Turk. Not only like the Turk is a scourge of God, but there is no sign of any benevolence from the Turk towards the Christians. Rather, they are tricky, they are unreliable, and they even built up a system of action how to persuade the Christians turn into Muslim believers. The first, according to this, they announce that they fight for the power, not for the religion. Second, if the taxes are paid, they claim, they can live with their faith. Secondly, the Turks increases the taxes. Thirdly, the Turkish authority introduces administration which offers freedom for converters, while the rest has to endure unbearable burdens. And finally, they kidnap boys and bring about poverty and slavery. So according to this, there is a systematic, brutal, how to say, suppression on the part of the Turk and a Muslim. Obviously, this source is also something like, I wouldn't say ideological, but it has a purpose. He wanted to show something like how we suffer Christians, almost like martyrs. In the traditional, I mean, the 70s and 80s church historians tended to think that the first, like Cigerius, is the 40s, 50s, and Turi is rather the 60s, 70s. So there's a certain development. After the Turk managed to settle down and sort of consolidate their power, they changed their sort of policy towards the Protestants. Actually, I'm not sure, and even in the historiography, it's sort of revised. I mean, this is also sort of teleological interpretation. But I'm not going into this. How much time I do have? Like? Oh, okay. Actually, I come to the point of my. But then I think I'm gonna just summarize it. What I really wanted to show, it's in other respect, and I think for myself it's much more interesting, is really how the function in confessional writings. And I think I'm just gonna have one document is the Confessio Catholica, confession of Protestants of Debrecen, Nagyvárad, and Eger. This was a really interesting situation that here in the 60s when Miklós Olah and Antal Verancic, Archbishop and Bishop, sort of started a counter-reformation, let's say counter-reformation activity. Protestant synod here in this region gathered somehow to create a confession and how they could defend themselves against the Catholics. Just one thing which is really important, that the border is floating. So especially Debrecen is sometimes here, sometimes there. Now on this map belongs to Transylvania, but previously here. And actually they pay taxes in 2-3 directions, so it's kind of really border zone. One more thing, it's really important that the soldiers of Eger actually around this time when Verancic is driving away the Protestant ministers from Eger, turn to Debrecen for help, send something, we should defend ourselves, especially before Ferdinand. So the whole confession is actually, even in modern publication, is 200 pages, quite huge. It has actually everything you can imagine, like mathematics, actually I don't have, this is the Confessio Catholica. Really a kind of hodgepodge, including nightmares, witchcraft, trade. This is a huge confession. Actually, it has a function of having everything. So what happened, they send it to Eger with a different preface. And the preface is very interesting. They claim that they want to defend themselves against Verancic, the bishop. He's the not heretic, but he's the infidel, because he goes against the canon law, because he's the captain of the fort, Eger, and also a bishop, which goes against canon law. They use actually Catholic reasoning against the Catholic bishop, and they claim that they are as orthodox as Ferdinand is. That's why the title is Catholic, and later sometime wrote their Calviniana. Why is this interesting? Because actually there are really detailed parts of this text about the magistrate, about war, and whether it's how to deal with the Turk. I think I have to summarize. But what is really interesting, in the preface, they refer to the Protestant Christians, how to say, role, and the kingdom's role as a propugnaculum, as a bulwark of Christianity. But when you get into the text, it has a different perspective. For instance, when they deal with magistrate, they don't mention the Turk too much, but they also say that there's a function which the magistrate should fulfill. And obedience is so the criteria of the obedience is the command, as I mentioned before with Luther. And also when you go into the detail about the war and military feudus, so like associations, how to say, Bund, so you know what I mean. And also whether you can fight war with the Turk. They actually claim, yes, you can fight with the Turk against the invader. They don't say who is the invader, but as long as the cause is godly. So the criteria of making a military coalition with the Turk is the cause and the purpose of the military coalition. It could be fought, obviously, even against the Catholics, or even against Protestants, but they don't say it. And actually, it's really elaborate, long argumentation on these issues. Why I start to raise this? Because the function of the Turk is okay, so the role of the Turk is rather functional, just like the Christian magistrate. So here you see this kind of division of what I mentioned, so-called this kind of Lutheran division of the functions. What is rather contradictory with the text, that in the earlier part, the session on the magistrate, when they say what is the duties of the magistrate, they are rather Melancthonian. They don't say that it's neutral. No, you have to be at schools and punish the idolatry and kill them. So in the same text, these two kind of approaches there. It's totally contradictory. But why I say it's really important, this text, is because of the Bocskai rebellion. I don't think I have time for this. But it just very quickly, the role of Bocskai is really controversial, even in Hungary, in the contemporaries, but in Europe even more. Actually, he received early from the Sultan a sword, so that was his subordination, and later a crown. And diplomatic mission sent to Germany was about to explain themselves how the hell we made coalition with the Turks. And I can just, and there are, which are the general charges against Bocskai: conspiration, rebellion, Arianismus, and Turkish, how to say, friendship and everything. And and there are declarations, I cannot delve into detail, but actually there are two very interesting arguments. One argument is that this coalition with the Turk is actually for the sake of the Christian faith, which is quite paradoxical, because Rudolf, the Catholic, actually destroyed us as the bulwark of Christianity. So we cannot defend Christianity anymore. So if we don't make this move towards the Turk, then Europe and Christianity would fall. So we have to sacrifice ourselves to defend Christianity. Actually, you who criticize us. This is one stream. This is one of the most important. It seemed to be the most important diplomatic text. It turned out it was not the most important, but doesn't matter at this point. There's a long tradition here, and the official one is a bit more modest, but I'm not getting into. So this is one of the important claims. This is from München. It's the Heidelberg. And also there are many publications in French and English. It turned out it was not written by Hungarians. They are pirate copies anyway. It's just interesting. And that's another interesting text, Excusatio. It has an Italian, also German translation, Entschuldigung, the title, where actually they have a quite different position. They actually refer here, as opposed to all the other texts, that the conscience is free. And actually, this conscience could be guaranteed under the Turk better than under the Catholics. So this kind of comparative apologetic argument comes back, but it's relatively early, 1604. So what I wanted to sort of suggest here, and I'm sorry running out of my time, that there is a theological disposition built up in the mid-16th century. Even if this Confessio Catholica was not successful, after 1 year they had to replace with a new confession of Torda, and later in 7 years the second Debrecen confession, because it was so long and didn't work. Even that confession was replaced with other one, because this prolific confession writing didn't lead anywhere. But for me, it reveals something of the mindset, so how they thought of this actual situation. So we should find a modus vivendi, how to live under, with, or beside the Turk. And we should explain ourselves first theologically, flexibly enough, but somehow satisfying solution. And why this is important for the later period, I think even for the Bethlehem period, because when you arrive there, the Hungarian Reformed are preconditioned to accept this military role of the Turk relatively easily. There are debates whether it's good or not, but I haven't found too much theological debate on this. So this necessity argument is there. It's not only propaganda, they actually accepted this. I think I will finish here, and thank you for the attention.